Last year's sweep of revolutions in the Middle East and North Africa inspired hope in America that change had come to a region in need of new ideas and representative government. Now, as many of these countries strive to establish democratic institutions, escalating violence in Syria and deadly attacks on U.S. installations in Libya and Egypt have left the American people with conflicted feelings about the region and just how engaged the U.S. should be.
On the one hand, we find that a slight majority of Americans still believe that the conflict between the U.S. and Arab and Muslim countries is principally over interest, not over religion and culture. It's not a clash of civilization.
In his new poll, Americans on the Middle East, non-resident senior fellow Shibley Telhami takes the pulse of American attitudes regarding the Middle East, the rise of its new nations, and the fear of growing anti-U.S. sentiment.
A strong majority of Americans, over 60%, do believe that these attacks in both Libya and Egypt were supported only by minority extremists and not by majorities of the population. In much more nuanced reaction than I would have expected, particularly given the discourse and the initial reaction in the press.
Tens of billions of U.S. dollars have flowed into Egypt and Libya for decades. Money for schools, food, and weapons. Telhami's poll shows that in light of recent events, many Americans say now's the time to rethink our aid policies to those countries.
Only a minority, about 29%, they want to see the aid cut altogether. So yeah, they're against aid, and when you put arguments on aid, they seem to be opposed to it. They want it cut, but they don't want it stopped.
Americans continue to see U.S. relations with the Muslim world and the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict as critical foreign policy issues. But the Arab uprisings have altered American thinking on these issues.
When we started the polling on the Arab uprisings in April 2011, a plurality of Americans said that these uprisings are more about ordinary people seeking freedom and democracy than about Islamist groups trying to take control. The number of people who said it was about ordinary people already went down by August 2011. But in this particular poll, they went down even more. And more people think it's about Islamist groups than about ordinary people seeking democracy. That, to be fair, may be a methodological problem because we're asking them about their opinions about, quote, the Arab uprisings, by which we mean what people call the Arab Spring. And yet we were also asking them about the recent demonstrations, and they may be confusing the two.
The Middle East is plagued with big problems, and an Israeli strike on Iran remains a concern for America. Many of those polled think such an action could lead the nation to war and to higher gasoline costs.
The overwhelming majority, more than 3/4, believe that the oil prices would increase, quotes, drastically. The vast majority believe Iran would attack American facilities and the U.S. would be drawn into war. A majority believes that the U.S. would be worse off strategically in the Middle East if Israel were to attack Iran. When you ask them, therefore, should the U.S. encourage Israeli attack, discourage an Israeli attack, or be neutral, meaning to say we're not going to get involved, you find, surprisingly, a majority saying be neutral, or a plurality across almost every segment of the population.
As the conflict in Syria grows, so does U.S. concern about escalating tensions there. Americans want peace in Syria, but arming anti-government groups, bombing Syrian air defenses, or sending U.S. troops into Syria is out of the question for many of those polled.
Roughly 60% believe that the U.S. should increase the sanctions on the Syrian regime, but only 22% believe we should arm the rebels. And roughly the same number think that we should bomb Syrian facilities, and even fewer believe that we should send troops. The one area where there was something of a surprise is that you had 59% say they support a no-fly zone.
U.S. ties in the Middle East have always been important, Telhami notes, adding that the next president needs to focus on fortifying those relationships.
The new administration is going to face, in some ways, another juncture of redefining the relationship. When you look at American public priorities, the Middle East today is not very high in those priorities.